At 12:15, on a clear, cold but very windy day, 23-year-old Bayard S. Berghaus was dropped off by his father and younger brother at the entrance to Marine Barracks, Philadelphia Navy Yard, after a 96-mile trip east from the little town of Marietta, Pennsylvania. It was Monday, February 2nd, 1942, just 8 weeks after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Called to active duty, Second Lieutenant Berghaus had been ordered to Marine Corps Basic School at the Navy Yard for 12 weeks of instruction to prepare him for assignment to a combat unit. After saying goodbye to his father, the Episcopalian minister in his hometown, and brother, Berghaus collected a footlocker containing helmet, gas mask, belt, and holster, headed over to Barracks 101 of the school, and entered Room 3. One of his new roommates, Morris Ahern, a graduate of Tufts University, was already settled in, but the other had not shown up yet. Berghaus knew the second roommate wouldn't be his Washington and Lee University classmate Richard W. Smith, though. They were the only two W&L 41 graduates who had signed up for the Marine Corps Eastern Platoon Leaders class in 1938 and had spent 6 weeks each summer following their sophomore and junior years in basic training. Commissioned as reserve second lieutenants upon graduation, Berghaus and Smith were now together again for further training at the Navy Yard as members of the 2nd Basic School Reserve Officers class. Instruction began 2 days later. Berghaus, who was serious, quiet, and reserved by nature, was wondering how the school would be able to pack so much in so little time, just 3 months for what he thought should be a 9-month course. When informed originally that he was going to basic school, he had expected a much longer period of instruction that he felt was needed to prepare him as a platoon leader. 2 days before Berghaus and the other 189 members of his battalion began their classes on February 4th, Second Lieutenant George Codrea commenced his own active duty training as a member of the 7th Reserve Officers class at Quantico, Virginia. Unlike the PLC officers at the basic school, however, Codrea had no prior Marine Corps instruction during summers, while a student at Akron University in Ohio. After a stint with B.F. Goodrich following his graduation in June 1940, the 24-year-old of Romanian heritage had signed up for the Marine Corps Officers Candidate class that began at Quantico on November 1, 1941, and along with the 318 other survivors of the 3-month qualifying course, was now a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps Reserve and assigned to an additional 3 months of training in the AROC. "Mud, mud, and more mud," Jack Rivers muttered to himself on the morning of February 18, 1942, as he poked his nose outside. It was biting cold. Only the smoking kerosene stove on the wooden floor provided any warmth for Rivers and his squad mates in the tent hut that was now his home at the Marine Barracks, New River, North Carolina. But Rivers was not really complaining. Life was proving much easier than it had been at Paris Island, where the 23-year-old recruit had endured 5 weeks of grueling boot camp before reporting in at New River on February 13, 1942. After graduating from high school and gaining employment at Bethlehem Steel, Rivers had taken up professional boxing and was in tip-top physical shape when he enlisted in the Marine Corps shortly after Pearl Harbor and reported in at Paris Island on January 5th. Dubbed in the boxing world Indian Johnny Rivers, he could take any punishment the Marine Corps could dish out. Raised in a Lutheran orphans' home, Rivers now had a family for the first time, his buddies in the squad to which he'd been assigned and who shared the hut with him. Particularly close was Al Schmid, with whom he'd bonded from the time they together boarded the train from New Jersey that would take them to Paris Island. Both were assigned at New River on reporting in to a machine gun platoon, one of the 3 such platoons in H Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment, following reactivation of the battalion on February 11, 1942. In another hut in the H Company area, 21-year-old Bob Leckie was wondering why he, a sports writer before he enlisted on December 8, 1941, had been selected as a machine gunner. On his arrival the night before, he was perfunctorily assigned to the 1st Marine Regiment, and the next day the H Company commander, whom Leckie would refer to as Captain High Hips, in his very British manner assigned Leckie to a squad in a machine gun platoon. Unknown to Leckie, the moustached Captain John Howland, a 31-year-old graduate of Harvard University, BA in 1932 and LLB in 1936, had spent a year at Exeter College, Oxford, where he had evidently picked up his British mannerisms before enlisting in the Marine Corps and being called to active duty in 1940. Howland's H Company, the weapons company of the 2nd Battalion, was comprised of 3 machine gun platoons, a mortar platoon, and a platoon of 37 mm anti-tank guns and .50 caliber machine guns. But for the time being, the company had no officers other than Howland. Its veteran non-commissioned officers would be providing the training on the company's weapons and moulding Rivers, Leckie and the others into fighting men. For 17-year-old Sid Phillips, being assigned to H Company's mortar platoon on his arrival by train from Paris Island appeared an arbitrary decision too. He was just a high school kid from Mobile, Alabama, who, like the others, had survived the 5 weeks of conceived nightmare at Paris Island. On arrival at New River on February 13th, Phillips and the others with him were marched off to stand in ranks outside a lighted hut that served as an office, and then called in, one at a time, and interviewed by NCOs inside the hut. To Sid, it was silly, because everyone was assigned to the 1st Marines. He was then additionally ordered to H Company's mortar platoon and to Gun Squad 4, which to his delight turned out with one exception to be comprised entirely of fellow Southerners. Sid Phillips may have thought that the formalities of assigning everyone to the 1st Marines was inane, but then he and the others reporting in with him to the 1st Marine Division were ignorant of the plight of the regiment in early February 1942. It had just been reactivated at New River and was being built up from scratch to meet the needs of the division for a 3rd regiment other than just on paper. At the time of its reactivation, it had consisted of only 160 key personnel, just senior officers and veteran NCOs. Its 1st Battalion was the first to be reactivated on February 7th, followed by the 2nd Battalion on February 11th and the 3rd Battalion on February 16th. P.C. John Joseph from Cambridge, Massachusetts, felt that his mastering of the M1903 Springfield rifle at Paris Island explained why he was assigned on February 13th to G Company, one of the 3 rifle companies of the 2nd Battalion. A self-described city slicker, he had never fired a weapon other than a Daisy air rifle before enlisting in the Marine Corps. But instead of being selected for one of the rifle platoons, he had drawn G Company's weapons platoon, equipped with .30 caliber air-cooled machine guns and 60 mm mortars. He was pleasantly surprised to find that the platoon was being run by CPL Willis Accord, his old drill instructor at Paris Island, and another old-breed NCO, CPEL Stanley Nesikowski. In fact, the only officer in G Company was the CO, Captain James Sherman, a 1936 graduate of Tufts College from Somerville, Massachusetts, a reservist who had worked in the private sector for 4 years before being called to active duty in 1939. Buddies Hugh Morse from Auburn, Indiana, and Jack Gardner from Syracuse, New York, were selected as Browning automatic rifle (BAR) men in a rifle platoon of the 1st Battalion's A Company. It was an assignment both sought to avoid, but they had qualified as sharpshooters on the BAR during their Paris Island boot training, despite their best efforts to avoid the distinction. They knew damned well that anyone who qualified was going to get stuck with carrying one of those monsters in a rifle company when assigned afterwards to a unit. Hoping to boost the other's score and lower his own, Morse had fired on Gardner's target while Gardner fired on Morse's, but their strategy failed when both got top marks. To the south of the 1st Marine Regiment's site, near Verona, the camp of the 3rd Battalion, 11th Marine Regiment, the artillery unit of the 1st Marine Division, looked to Pursuit Bill White like a Civil War encampment on his arrival there to take up his assignment in late January 1942. The 16-year-old native of Clarksdale, Mississippi, had lied about his age when he enlisted in September 1941, and now found himself assigned to the battalion's headquarters battery after finishing boot camp at Paris Island and training in telephone communications at Quantico. He found the living conditions at the camp primitive: no shower facilities, water trucked in, limited electricity. To fend off the bitter cold, He and the others were wearing overcoats over long johns, using towels for earmuffs, and sometimes blankets as covers. "They're putting us through the mill, all right," Jack Rivers wrote to his sister in mid-March. Training for the men of the 2nd Battalion in the flat, swampy area of New River was becoming more intense. "And the weather is getting hot as heck," he added. Rivers, Alschmid, and the others were now sharing the hut with their newly appointed squad leader, Seaplipel Leroy Diamond. Promoted from private first class on March 9th, Diamond was then transferred to H Company's 3rd Machine Gun Platoon from his old G Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. Still in its rebuilding process, the 1st Marine Regiment needed more NCOs. Over in H Company's 1st Machine Gun Platoon, newly promoted PFC Bob Leckie had become good friends with PC Louis Jurgens, whom he would refer to later as Chuckler for his good-natured chortling. They were learning the mysteries of the heavy, water-cooled M1917 A1 Browning machine gun. Jurgens, as the gunner, would carry the 54-pound tripod, and Leckie, as assistant gunner, the 40-pound gun. By mid-March, the two had mastered use of the gun and could even take it apart and reassemble it blindfolded. As was the case for all the other platoons in the 2nd Battalion, and in fact for the whole 1st Regiment, there still was no second lieutenant to lead the platoon. Sergeant Frank Stewart was in charge of them. Despite being only 3 months older than Leckie, he was a world apart in experience, having already served over 3 years as a regular since enlisting in September 1938 when he turned 18. Leckie would later refer to him as Sergeant Thin-Face. Sid Phillips and the other stovepipers of his squad in H Company's mortar platoon had now also mastered their weapon, the 81mm mortar, with which they were now equipped some 2 weeks after being assigned to the platoon. Before then, they had had to make do with imaginary weapons of lumber in their training. By mid-March, they could even quote the manual for the mortar by heart. Every day, all day, they were marching several miles out from their hut for gun drill and field problems, then marching back to their huts for the evening. As Leckie had noted for his own squad, Phillips and his comrades regarded their squad as different from any other. It was its almost exclusive composition of Southerners that set their rebel squad apart from the others. In fact, in Leckie's view, the only common denominator of all the squads in H Company was their dislike of officers and discipline. Over at the 37mm Anti-Tank Platoon of H Company, CPL, George Parker was continuing his earlier training as a 37mm gun crewman, firing on the special range for the weapon. The 20-year-old native of Cameron, West Virginia, had enlisted back in September 1940, and after Paris Island, had been assigned to the 1st Marine Division at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, then moved on to Quantico, where he had begun his training on the 37mm. In the 2nd Battalion's G Company, Pursuit John Joseph and the men of his weapons platoon had graduated from refresher training on their Springfield 03S and bayonet use to operation of the air-cooled .30 caliber light machine guns and the platoon's 260mm mortars. There was a lot of simulated firing and drilling, but Joseph himself was mainly occupied as a runner between the platoon and G Company headquarters. Communications exercises were keeping Peevset Bill White busy 3 times a week at Headquarters Battery, 3rd Battalion, 11th Marines. It was hard work for the 16-year-old, laying telephone lines and setting up radio circuits for artillery exercises. And when everything was in place and working, White and the others would have to take it all down and start over again. On the afternoon of Monday, March 23rd, 2nd Lieutenant Bayard Berghaus received orders transferring him on temporary duty from basic school at the Philadelphia Navy Yard to the State Military Reservation, Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, 90 miles northwest of Philadelphia, for instruction in the practical use of infantry weapons. All 190 members of his 2nd Basic School ROC were to report in at the Marine Corps encampment there on March 29th to begin training that would extend over 3 weeks, topping off the 8 weeks of basically classroom instruction at the school. This schedule implied that the 12 weeks duration of the basic school course was being shortened by a week. For George Codrier and his 318 classmates at Quantico, it was a similar story. On his battalion's return on a Saturday morning from a field exercise, they found a bit of astounding news waiting. Their 3-month 7th Reserve Officers class, scheduled to end on April 30th, was being shortened by a full month. As they stood to receive their diplomas at the Quantico Marine Corps base on April 1st, they realized that this was indeed no April Fool's joke. Codrier and most of the others were now being ordered immediately to New River, North Carolina, to join the 1st Marine Division. "You fools are here to learn to fight," Captain Martin F. Rockmore bellowed as he swaggered up and down the line in front of Don Moss, an artist in civilian life, and the other assembled E Company men on April 6, 1942. They had just completed 6 weeks of basic training at Parris Island before reporting into the 1st Marine Division at New River and being assigned to E Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, one of the battalion's 3 rifle companies. Private Moss had just completed art school and was working for a printing company when he had enlisted in the Marine Corps. After glowering at his new charges, Rockmore, a 34-year-old graduate in economics from St. Lawrence University, Canton, New York, and a reservist now on active duty, turned Moss and some 40 of the others in the platoon over to 2nd Lieutenant Dean Stover, who had just arrived at New River too and had been assigned to lead E Company's 1st Rifle Platoon. The 23-year-old native of Salina, Pennsylvania, had graduated from Penn State University in June 1940 and had decided to leave his shipping clerk job to join the Marine Corps and enter officer candidate class to avoid being drafted. Stover and the other 2nd lieutenants accompanying him to New River from Quantico on April 5th, graduates of the 7th Reserve Officers class at Quantico, were finally providing the 1st Marine Division, and in Stover's case its 1st Marine Regiment, with many of the junior officers sorely needed to lead the platoons in each of the companies of the battalions. In addition to Stover, the 2nd Battalion was assigned 6 others, while another 10 were ordered to the 1st Battalion. 2 of the newly arrived graduates of the 7th ROC going to the 1st Battalion were assigned to 1st Lieutenant Nick Stevenson's C Company. Until then, C-11 was without any platoon leader officers. John Rentz, from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Jim Wagner, from Richmond, Virginia, were each given a rifle platoon to lead, leaving the positions of 3rd Rifle Platoon Leader, Weapons Platoon Leader, and Executive Officer, following the departure of 2nd Lieutenant Clarence Mabry, still to be filled. Stevenson, who was 2 weeks short of his 23rd birthday, had been appointed CO of C Company only weeks earlier, when the only officer in the company was the executive, Lieutenant Mabry, a January 31st, 1942, graduate of the 6th ROC. A 1940 graduate of Columbia University, Stevenson had signed up for OCS that fall, and on graduation from the 4th ROC on June 1st, 1941, he had been assigned as a platoon leader in the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, at Parris Island. When his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Julian N. Frisbee, was transferred to command the 1st Marine Regiment at New River on March 23, 1942, he brought Stevenson and 2 other junior officers from his 3rd Battalion with him to the 1st Marines. Frisbee gave Stevenson a company command position, despite the fact that Stevenson was still only a 2nd lieutenant, a problem of rank that would be rectified on April 14th when Stevenson was promoted to 1st lieutenant. The men of the 2nd Battalion, particularly those like Jack Rivers, were facing more intense training in the flat, swampy area of New River by mid-March. The increasing heat added to their challenges. Rivers, along with Al Schmid and others, shared their hut with their newly appointed squad leader, CPL Leroy Diamond. Promoted from private first class on March 9th, Diamond was transferred to H Company's 3rd Machine Gun Platoon from G Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. As the 1st Marine Regiment continued its rebuilding process, more NCOs like Diamond were needed. In H Company's 1st Machine Gun Platoon, newly promoted PFC, Bob Leckie became good friends with P.V.Tit. Louis Juergens, who earned the nickname Chuckler for his good-natured demeanour. Together they were mastering the heavy water-cooled M1917A1 Browning machine gun, with Jurgens as the gunner and Leckie as his assistant. By mid-March they had gained such proficiency that they could take the gun apart and reassemble it blindfolded. Meanwhile, Sergeant Frank Stewart, just 3 months older than Leckie but with over 3 years of service, was leading the platoon in the absence of a second lieutenant. Leckie would later refer to Stewart as Sergeant Thinface. Sid Phillips and his fellow stovepipers in H Company's mortar platoon were mastering the 81 mm mortar, having spent earlier weeks training with makeshift wooden replicas. By mid-March they could recite the mortar's manual by heart, and their days consisted of long marches to gun drills and field exercises. Phillips and his squad, largely composed of Southerners, took pride in being the rebel squad of the company. Despite the camaraderie within each squad, there was a shared distaste for officers and discipline. Over in the 37 mm anti-tank platoon, Seaplough George Parker continued his training as a gun crewman. The 20-year-old West Virginian had been working with the 37 mm since his assignment to the 1st Marine Division. Meanwhile, Puriter John Joseph and the men of G Company's weapons platoon graduated from training with their Springfield 03S to handling air-cooled .30 caliber light machine guns and 60 mm mortars. Joseph himself spent much of his time acting as a runner between the platoon and company headquarters. In Headquarters Battery, Peavitt Bill White, just 16 years old, was busy laying telephone lines and setting up radio circuits for artillery exercises. He and his fellow Marines would set up communications equipment, only to tear it down and start again 3 times a week. On March 23rd, 2nd Lieutenant Bayard Berghaus received orders to report for training at Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania, where he and his class would undergo practical weapons training, building on their classroom instruction. Similarly, George Codrea and his classmates at Quantico had their reserve officers' class shortened by a full month, much to their surprise. By April 1st, Codrea and many others were ordered to New River, North Carolina, to join the 1st Marine Division. At New River, Captain Martin F. Rockmore welcomed Don Moss and other recruits to E Company with a stern reminder that they were there to learn how to fight. Moss, an artist in civilian life, was part of E Company's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, and under the command of 2nd Lieutenant Dean Stover, who had just arrived from Quantico. Stover, a Penn State graduate, was part of the 7th Reserve Officers class and was one of several new junior officers assigned to the 1st Marine Division. His arrival, along with other new officers like John Rentz and Jim Wagner in C Company, filled some of the many vacant leadership positions within the regiment. Another junior officer transferred to the 1st Marines was Charles H. Brush, already a 1st lieutenant. Brush took command of A Company on April 1st, just days before 2nd lieutenants. John Yakim and Victor Valente arrived from the 7th ROC. Lieutenant Colonel Julian Frisbee, known as the Bull for his large frame and loud command, had taken temporary command of the 1st Marine Regiment while waiting for Colonel Clifton Cates to assume permanent leadership. Frisbee had transferred from the 7th Marines, leaving part of his battalion behind in Samoa. As new recruits continued arriving at New River, the 1st Regiment neared full strength, though junior officer positions remained unfilled. Major William Chalfant III was transferred from the 7th Marines to temporarily serve as the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, now housing around 870 officers and men. E Company, led by Rockmore and Stover, pushed its recruits hard, marching them for miles under the weight of their combat packs. Live ammunition drills, grenade throwing, and exhausting marches became the norm. Moss, though physically drained, found himself growing stronger and more confident in his abilities as a Marine. In G Company, 1st Platoon Leader George Codrea faced scrutiny from his senior non-commissioned officers. Sergeant Charlie Spakes and Sergeant Jim Hancock were veterans with years of experience, and Codrea knew he had to earn their respect. When offered chewing tobacco by Spakes, Codrea accepted without hesitation, winning the sergeant's approval. Codrea, one of the officers from the 7th ROC, was learning how to lead while adjusting to life in the 1st Marine Division. Similarly, Berghaus and his fellow officers in the 2nd Basic School ROC were undergoing their own transitions, moving from classroom instruction to hands-on weapons training at Indiantown Gap. The rough conditions of the wooden barracks and the muddy grounds were a stark contrast to the relative comfort of their earlier training, but the practical experience was invaluable as they became familiar with machine guns, mortars, and other infantry weapons. By mid-April, both new recruits and junior officers alike were finding their place within the ranks, learning the skills necessary for the battles to come. "We're moving out to the boondocks. Enlisted men will fall out tomorrow morning in full marching gear." Sergeant Frank Stewart's order on April 24th was not greeted with enthusiasm by Bob Leckie and the others in H Company's 1st Machine Gun Platoon, but the men were not planning to prepare for the move without confirmation from the 2nd Battalion's new commanding officer. Much to the disappointment of the men, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin A. Pollock authorized the order the next morning. The 43-year-old career Marine officer from Augusta, Georgia, with almost 22 years in the service after graduation from the Citadel in 1921, had arrived 2 days earlier at New River from his previous post at the Marine Corps School's Quantico to take up his new assignment, replacing Major William Chalfont III, who was shifted down to serve as Pollock's executive officer. Pollock was wasting no time in stepping up training. Loaded down with some 20 pounds on their backs, plus their weapons, Leckie and his platoon mates set out on their 10-mile trek over a narrow dirt road through pine woods. The whole battalion was on the march, with Leckie's platoon somewhere in the centre. When Leckie and the others finally reached a canal that led out to the sea, they saw Higgins' boats waiting for them. Ordered to climb aboard the 36-man landing craft, they positioned themselves before the coxswains headed the plywood boats out to sea. As the boats rose and fell in the offshore surf, half of the men in Leckie's boat threw up. Then the assembled boats circled before they spread out in an assault line and headed to shore. When the craft ground to a halt on Onslow Beach, Leckie and the others jumped out and began marching to their new camp, a mile inland. In a cold rain, they began setting up the pup tents that would be their homes for the next weeks of manoeuvres in the boondocks. 3 days into their field exercises, Leckie's platoon was finally assigned an officer to lead it. 22-year-old Hugh Corrigan, along with 118 other reserve second lieutenants, had just arrived at New River from basic school, following orders issued on April 13th to report to the 1st Marine Division on or about April 20th for new duty. Corrigan had graduated in January 1942 from Dartmouth, just in time to receive his reserve commission and be sent to basic school on February 2nd for 11 weeks of further training. In addition to Corrigan, 16 other PLC graduates were assigned platoon leader positions in the 2nd Battalion, 17 in the 1st Battalion, and 18 in the 3rd Battalion. Now, for the first time since the 3 battalions of the 1st Regiment were reactivated over 2 months earlier, all their junior officer positions were filled. Joining Corrigan in the 2nd Battalion's H Company, Robert Porky Malloy found himself in charge of the 2nd Machine Gun Platoon, and Bill Wharf the 3rd Platoon, while George Swinston, like Wharfer Sr. at Amherst College when commissioned, drew the 37 mm anti-tank gun platoon. Both Wharf and Swinston had been in the class of June 1942, but had their education aborted when they were commissioned and called to active duty in February. In Don Moss's E Company, 20-year-old John Williams, a Dartmouth man from Orange, New Jersey, also set to graduate in June 1942, was assigned to the 3rd Rifle Platoon. Leadership of the company's weapons platoon fell to A. William Monk Larson, who had also graduated from Dartmouth, but in June 1941, when he was commissioned. Over at F Company, Ed Craig, slated to graduate in June 1942 from Columbia University, was assigned a rifle platoon. Similarly, Luther Jordan's education at Washington and Lee University in the class of June 1942 was cut short when he was commissioned in February 1942, and he now was taking over G Company's 3rd Rifle Platoon. 3 of the PLC graduates assigned to the 1st Battalion reported in to Nick Stevenson's C Company. Marisa Hearn from Marshfield, Massachusetts, and a graduate of Tufts College, was put in charge of the 3rd Rifle Platoon. Bob Fowler, a Dartmouth graduate in the class of 1941, was appointed leader of the Weapons Platoon. Irving Perry Perrine took over the 2nd Rifle Platoon as John Rentz shifted up to Company Executive Officer. All officer positions in C Company were now filled. Assigned to the 3rd Battalion, Bayard Berghaus, 1 year Jordan's senior at Washington and Lee, found himself given command of one of the 3 rifle platoons in L Company. 3 of his classmates at basic school, J. Griffith, William Fitzhugh, and Alfred Minervini, took over the other 2 rifle platoons and the weapons platoon. All the junior officer positions thus fell to PLC graduates, except that of the executive officer, to which Lou Shine, a 7th ROC graduate, was assigned. Also sent to the 3rd Battalion, Bill Sager and his University of Virginia roommate, Herman Abady, were assigned leadership of the 1st and 3rd Rifle Platoons of K Company, under Captain Bob Putnam. Phil Wilhite, 2nd in seniority among the 3 based on the date of commission, drew the 2nd Rifle Platoon. Before heading off to the boondocks to take over their new positions, they set themselves up in their new accommodations, small compartments in the wooden barracks just adequate for a cot, small table and footlocker. At least the living quarters for the junior officers at New River were superior to those for the enlisted men in their pyramidal tents. Over at the 11th Marine Regiment's encampment, yet another Dartmouth man checked in on April 27th with the other PLC graduates. At 25 years, Gil Small was older than the others, having graduated and been commissioned in June 1938. At the time, the Wayland, Massachusetts native was called to active duty on February 6th. He was working on his PhD in chemistry, so he was clearly the most highly educated of the 119 second lieutenants reporting in for duty. He was pleased to find himself assigned to I Battery, 3rd Battalion, as he didn't want an infantry platoon leadership position. But with no previous training in field artillery, he felt he was being rushed into war. But Gil Small was not the oldest of the group. That distinction fell to the 33-year-old Irving V.G. Perry Perrine from East Orange, New Jersey. Perrine's situation was markedly different from that of the others. He had joined the Marine Corps Reserve back in 1931, following graduation from Princeton University the year before, and had been ordered to Indiantown Gap with the much younger PLC graduates just for a refresher course in the use of infantry weapons. On reporting in to New River, Perrine, still a bachelor, was assigned as leader of a rifle platoon in the 1st Battalion's C Company. Despite his advanced age and tame civilian experience as an insurance underwriter, Perrine, unlike Small, was pleased to get an assignment with an infantry unit, and a platoon leader's position was just the ticket, he figured. The field training was continuing apace in early May 1942, much to the displeasure of Purtle John Joseph in G Company. He regarded the boondocks, with copperhead snakes and soot everywhere due to the frequent burning of the trees, as a god-forsaken place. Under the command of their new platoon leaders, Joseph and the other men of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions were spending most of their time in exercises consisting of drills in scouting and patrolling and setting up surprise ambushes, as well as further instruction in the care and maintenance of their weapons. Along with their platoon second lieutenants, the men were also still practicing amphibious operations, this time using a wooden mock-up of the side of a transport that had been positioned on a bank of the inland waterway. They were ordered to climb up the stairs of the structure, then go down the cargo nets that hung over the sides and jump into Higgins boats. When the boats were loaded, the coxswains would take them out into the open sea, assemble, and then speed in for landings on Onslow Beach. In addition to the daytime landing exercises, one was scheduled for night during the week allotted for the amphibious landing practice. During the night exercise, Bill Sager's K Company platoon managed to land right on target in their Higgins boat. However, his was the only one in the 3rd Battalion to reach its designated beach area. The others screwed up and became confused after missing their intended sections of Onslow Beach, wandering around in the dark and not knowing where they were. Gil Small was out in the boondocks too, preparing himself to serve as a forward observer for his I Battery. In early May, he found himself running around in the pine woods, sweating and covered with soot from previous forest fires, while working on a communications problem. He was now joined as I Battery's other forward observer by newly minted Second Lieutenant Brooks Johnson, a native of Tupelo, Mississippi, promoted from sergeant and transferred to Small's WWII Battery from 3rd Battalion's Headquarters Battery. But the rumours were now flying among the men of the 1st Marine Division that they would be moving out soon from New River. Their suspicions were confirmed when, on the night of Saturday, May 16th, the sister 5th Regiment suddenly left its camp. The regiment's departure was preceded a day earlier by that of General Vandergrift himself and his 1st Marine Division headquarters, followed by some supporting units. But no one knew where they were going, except that it was an overseas deployment. On the other side of the world, at Moji Harbour, Kyushu, Japan, on May 19th, 2nd Lieutenant Genjiro Inui was struck dumb with surprise. He had just returned with the others of his 8th Independent Anti-Tank Company from operations on Java, when they were ordered this day to embark immediately for another overseas assignment. They were now to be part of the Ichiki Shitai, under Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, commander of the 28th Infantry Regiment. Inui felt it an honour to be attached to the 28th Regiment, reputed to be the most highly skilled and best trained of the Japanese Army's regiments at the outset of the Pacific War. It had been formed in 1900 mostly from farmers and labourers of Asahigawa, on Hokkaido, the northernmost island of Japan. As part of the 7th Division, the 2nd Battalion of the 28th had engaged in heavy fighting against the Russians during the Nomonhan campaign of June-September 1939, in which it had suffered 80% casualties. Slowly brought back to strength following its return to Japan from Manchuria, the 28th was put under the command of Ichiki in July 1941 on his transfer from his instructor position in Tokyo at the Army's Infantry School. A 1916 graduate of the Imperial Army's Military Academy, Rikugun Shikan Gakko, Ichiki had graduated from the infantry school in 1934. He was well known as a mercurial leader for his involvement as a battalion commander in northern China in the July 1937 incident that led to the Sino-Japanese War, although it was his regimental commander who had decided to escalate the fighting. At 13:30, Inui and the other officers of the Ichiki Shitai assembled in the customs house of Moji for a meeting with their commander. Colonel Ichiki informed them that they were being ordered to capture Midway Island. Inui joined the others in giving 3 banzai for the Japanese Empire and for the success of their new duty. Following the meeting, they all proceeded down to the harbour, where Inui's company boarded the transport Zenyu Maru, destination Saipan, where the detachment was to hold practice drills for the Midway operation. Back at New River, the 1st Marines men were assembled beside the inland waterway and the transport mock-up on May 26th to hear Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox address them on this the last day of the Boondocks exercises. Bob Leckie, for one, felt that Knox had come down from Washington just to reassure himself that the 1st Marine Division, or what still remained of it at New River, actually existed. As soon as Knox finished his talk and reboarded the launch for the return trip from the waterway, the men broke camp and headed back to the previously unappreciated comforts of Tent City. 3 days later, on Friday, Captain Rockmore assembled his E-Company men for his own announcement. "You have 72 hours of leave. I want each and every one of you back here at 0900 on Monday. Dismissed." The COs at the other 2nd Battalion encampments were giving their men the same leave too, as were those of the 1st and 3rd Battalions. To Sid Phillips in H Company, when newly appointed Captain James Ferguson made the same announcement, it was a sure sign we would be moving soon. The men were not to go beyond 500 miles, but few were respecting the rule, as Phillips and many others set out hitchhiking to their distant homes. On the day before, the 2,559 men of the Ichiki Shitai were on the move too, but it was no leave for them. After just having completed drills on Saipan for the Midway operation, they had boarded transports for their mid-Pacific destination. Plans called for the men to land on the southern shore of Eastern Island from barges, each carrying 100 men. After halting at the reef, they would disembark and wade some 200 yards through the lagoon and onto the beach in their assault on the Americans. The appointment of Ferguson, a 1936 graduate of the Naval Academy, to take over H Company from Captain Howland, who was shifting to command F Company, as of April 23rd, was the only company command change in a spate of reassignments in the 1st Marine Regiment in anticipation of the move. Also in his H Company, Acting Plat Sergeant Carl Benson was promoted to 2nd Lieutenant and put in charge of the mortar platoon, assisted by 2nd Lieutenant Don Wheaton, a graduate of the 7th Reserve Officers class the previous month. But the most important new assignment was that of Colonel Clifton Cates, who took command of the entire regiment on May 3rd from Lieutenant Colonel Julian Frisby, who now became his executive officer. For the 45 PLC graduates assigned to the 1st Regiment, Cates was a familiar face. At the Navy Yard in Philadelphia, he had been in charge of their 10-week basic school training from February to April. He was now free to take up his regimental command. To 2nd Lieutenant Tom Barry of L Company, 3rd Battalion, Cates always looked as if he'd stepped out of a bandbox with his FDR-type cigarette holder down to the spit shine on his shoes. Training had now slacked off following the return of the men from their Memorial Day weekend leave. In early June, rosters were being made up for train assignments for the trip all knew they would soon be taking. The Atlantic Coastline Railroad was soon keeping Pursuit John Joseph and the others awake at night with its eerie whistles as it shunted cars into position at the New River base. Then, on June 12th, the men got the long-awaited word they were to move out immediately. Like Vandergrift and those of the already deployed 5th Regiment, the commanders of the 1st Regiment's 3 battalions would have considered as regrettable the high-level decision taken in Washington to move their men out of New River before they were combat-ready. It was bad enough that the boot camp training at Paris Island for their privates first class and privates, almost all Pearl Harbor recruits, and now comprising some 3/4 of their battalion's strength, had been reduced from the pre-war level of 8 weeks to 5 to 6 weeks. Experience would prove that the minimum length without sacrificing quality was 8 weeks. But now they would have to abort further training at New River and wait until after arrival at their new undisclosed destination for it to resume. Some 100 miles southwest of Midway Island, the convoy carrying the Ichikishitai was making a U-turn on June 9th to head back, destination Guam. Lieutenant Genjiru Inui and the others were simply informed that the Midway landing operations were put off. Colonel Ichiki's assault force was ordered dissolved, and the men were transferred to the direct control of the 2nd Fleet. 5 days earlier, the transports of the convoy had undergone an attack by 9 American planes, but that was the only thing the officers and men knew for sure about the now aborted Midway operation. They were being kept in the dark about the outcome of the naval battle of Midway. After over 3 weeks at sea, 2nd Lieutenant Genjiru Inui and the rest of the Japanese Army's Ichiki Shitai welcomed the prospect of a life on shore as their transports entered Apra Harbor, Guam, on Saturday, June 13th. But they were distressed to learn for the first time of the crushing defeat at Midway. Now they understood why they had been ordered to turn away from Midway Island 4 days earlier. As Inui and his comrades explored their new base, they were impressed by how well the Imperial Japanese Navy was governing the island, which had been seized from the Americans in December. Peace and order prevailed everywhere. The islanders even left their houses unlocked. They were also pleased with their new quarters, barracks on a slope overlooking the town of Apra that had formerly been occupied by the American Marines defending the island. The view of the ocean from the barracks was beautiful. Climbing up 1,500 meters through coconut groves, they were proud to see the rising sun ensign fluttering on the rooftop of the Navy headquarters building below. While the Ichiki Shitai was settling in at their new station, men of the 1st Marine Regiment were leaving theirs this Saturday. First-class Pullman cars in a long line were backed up at the New River rail spur of the Atlantic Coast Railroad, preparing to take on board the approximately 1,600 men of the regiment's 2nd and 3rd battalions. Although their ultimate destination was secret, Second Lieutenant Tom Barry of the 3rd Battalion's Y Company and other officers had been informed that they would be spending several months training in a mild climate. The deployment thus appeared to be a station-to-station movement, not to a combat zone. But this scanty information did not filter down to the enlisted men, whose privates, first class and privates, were kept in ignorant bliss. At 17:05, at the head of his platoon, 2nd Lieutenant Bayard Berghaus left the 3rd Battalion's camp and, as the Marine Band played, marched with his 41 men in ranks the few blocks to the station, where they boarded the wagons to which they had been assigned. The men located their seats, 26 to a wagon, and stowed their rifles and combat packs overhead in the racks. Berghaus himself and his fellow L Company platoon leader Bill Fitzhugh merited a small private compartment with bathroom at the end of the wagon, as did all the officers shipping out. This train was carrying K and L companies of the 3rd Battalion, and K Company's commanding officer, Captain Bob Putnam, was serving as train commander. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, the refrain from the Marine Corps hymn being played by the band, sent a strange thrill down Berghaus's spine as he stood in the passageway with his men, and they were waved off by the rest of the battalion. But the sight of Captain Putnam's wife sobbing uncontrollably as the train pulled out at 17:30 made you sort of hurt inside, a feeling Fitzhugh shared with Berghaus. 1 hour earlier, PFC Sid Phillips and the other 55 men of his oversized mortar platoon of H Company, 2nd Battalion, had managed to fit into a wagon of the train carrying their battalion. They were in the last car of the train, and attached right behind it was the caboose with the train's crew. This was going to be the first really long train ride for most of the Depression-era kids, and they intended to enjoy it. The last to climb aboard was the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Pollock, along with his headquarters company. At dinner time, Phillips and his buddies proceeded to the wagon in the middle of the train for a great meal. Their high-style living continued as uniformed porters, one to a wagon, converted the sitting areas for the enlisted men into sleeping quarters, folding out the upper and lower berths. Phillips and his best friend, John Deacon Tatum, shared the lower berth. It was hot and the train was not air-conditioned. Most of the sweating men opened their windows to catch some breezes, but this allowed in dust, soot and cinders from the coal-burning steam locomotives. No one complained, however. Their first-class Pullman accommodations sure beat their tents at New River and in the boondocks. At 07:45 the next morning, the 3rd Battalion's troop trains arrived at Greenville, South Carolina. In the train carrying 2 batteries of the 11th Marines, 2nd Lieutenant Gil Small was amused at the appearance of his basic school comrade 2nd Lieutenant Ray Winey, who had been sleeping in the lower bunk with the window down. Covered with soot, Winey looked like a Welsh coal miner to Small. That day it was the turn of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, to depart New River, the last remaining unit of the 1st Marine Division to leave. Most of the battalion's recently assigned platoon leaders were looking forward to their overseas deployment, but not C Company's Perry Perrine. He was in a foul mood due to a switch in his position made by Lieutenant Colonel Cresswell, the 3rd Battalion's CO, just before boarding the train. He was being forced to give up his 2nd Rifle platoon to become 1st Lieutenant Stevenson's executive officer. "They have taken my platoon away, and I have a full-time job as EO. I didn't want it and didn't like it, and screamed, yelled, kicked and bit like a yowling cornered bobcat, but they made it stick," he wrote his parents. His new assignment as C Company's executive officer took away the opportunity to engage in direct combat as a platoon leader, his prime objective in serving in the Marine Corps. As the troop trains headed west with the 3 battalions of the 1st Marines, the officers and men had little to do but enjoy the changing scenery. Lieutenants Berghaus and Fitzhugh also whiled away the time playing cards and throwing dice on and off during the day in the compartment that Lieutenants Sager and Herman Abady shared on their 3rd Battalion train. The only official duty they had was to disembark when their train reached a station and stand on the platform to prevent any civilians from boarding. On Guam, Second Lieutenant Inouye and the others of the Ichikishitai were also enjoying a leisurely life in mid-June. They spent their time watching movies at the Navy's lecture hall, including newsreels depicting the victory at Corregidor, biking around the island, and fishing. The only duty Inouye had was to supervise the swimming training of the 33 men who didn't know how to swim. "I wish I could be stationed here forever," Inouye confided to his diary. At 0840 on Thursday morning, June 18th, Bayard Berghaus woke up to find himself in California. It was hard for him to believe that they were 3,000 miles from New River, but he was glad the trip was soon ending. Everyone is black from the dirt and cinders, and he had no clean shirts. At 13:38, his 3rd Battalion arrived in Oakland, its last stop. Berghaus and the others disembarked and boarded buses that took them across the Oakland Bay Bridge to the San Francisco waterfront. At Pier 44, a large ocean liner painted dark grey awaited them. They were informed that it was the former Swedish-American line's Kungsholm, now rechristened the John Ericsson and in the service of the U.S. government as a troopship. Berghaus was disappointed to find that his assigned stateroom on B-deck didn't have a porthole, and was only big enough for one person, though he, Al-Minavini, and Abadi would have to share it. It was made all the more crowded by their luggage. Sid Phillips also was unhappy about his accommodations on the transport George F. Elliott, to which his 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, had been assigned. He and the other enlisted men didn't rate a stateroom, however small, but were instead crowded together in an open space, with wire racks as bunks, 5 high side by side. Toilet facilities for all were in one room, a head, 20 toilet seats side by side, and a few steel urinals some 20 feet long. Forget privacy, forget odours, forget everything. Sleep with your weapons, sleep with your pack, sleep with your life jacket, no sheets, just green USMC blankets, sleep in your clothing, Phillips recalled years later. And the grey-painted troopship was designated AP-13, an ominous number we did not particularly care for. To the officers and men of the 1st Battalion boarding the USS Barnett, AP-10, the ship was an old bucket of bolts with little character or outward grace about her. When the enlisted men descended below, they discovered how she could ingest the whole battalion and its equipment and supplies. The Navy was stacking them on berths 5 high between 7-foot stanchions, rather like cows at feeding, except we were lying down in stacks, an A Company man complained. But the personnel of the 3 battalions of the 1st Marines did not have to spend much time aboard their 3 transports during the days the ships were being loaded. The 2nd Battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Pollock, was very generous in allowing liberty until the day the Elliott should sail. However, on a pay of only $21 a month, most of which was spent on leave just before leaving New River, Phillips and his fellow privates first class and privates were too broke to really enjoy the sights of San Francisco. At least Phillips and the others in H Company's mortar platoon did not have to handle the loading of cargo ships carrying the 1st Marines' equipment, ammunition, and other supplies to the undisclosed destination, unlike the situation for George Codrea and his rifle platoon in G Company, among others. He had been ordered to supervise his men in loading some 9,000 tons of ammunition, small arms, hand grenades, mortar shells, from trucks into the largest hold of one of the attack cargo ships, but not according to combat loading procedures, another indication that the convoy was not heading for a combat zone. Using innovative, albeit unorthodox methods, Codrea managed to reduce by 2/3 the ammunition his men had to manhandle, gaining for him the approbation of Lieutenant Colonel Pollock and freeing up some of his men for liberty. For the 2nd lieutenants on the Ericsson, the free time was spent more pleasantly. Berghaus went into town the first day with Herman Abadi, Bill Sager, Al Minavini, Bill Fitzhugh, and Phil Wilhite, and took 2 rooms at the St. Francis Hotel. After eating in Chinatown, Berghaus and Abadi picked up some girls back at the hotel lounge and had a fine time that evening. Of the 11th Marines officers on the Ericsson, Gil Small was spending his liberty visiting with old Dartmouth classmates and their families living in San Francisco. At 15:50 on Monday, June 22nd, the MV John Ericsson finally weighed anchor and began heading west into the Pacific for Parts Unknown, the largest of the 3 transports departing San Francisco. More than 5,000 troops were jammed on board, including Lieutenant Col Bill McKelvey's 3rd Battalion, the 3rd and 5th Battalions of the 11th Marines, the 11th H&S Battery, the 1st Pioneer Battalion, -A Company, and other supporting units of the 1st Marine Division. To Berghaus, the situation on board was a mess. The men of his L Company were sleeping in 4 deep bunks on the closed-in promenade deck, in virtual darkness, and their chow situation was keeping them in line waiting almost all day. For the 11th Marines, it was taking almost 4 hours to feed everybody, First Sergeant Abe Felber complained in his diary. On board the George F. Elliot, which was carrying the 2nd Battalion 1st Marines, conditions were similar, though the transport was much smaller than the Ericsson. In addition to crowded quarters, the food was described as terrible and sparse, with only 2 meals a day, leaving the troops hungry all the time, as Sid Phillips noted. As the Elliot passed by Alcatraz Island, one 2nd Battalion man, facetiously expressing the views of those on board, waved to a man on the dock and shouted, "Hey, Lucky, want to trade places?" After passing under the Golden Gate Bridge and entering the open sea, Berghaus observed that the Ericsson was now part of a convoy of about 6 ships. His estimate was slightly off. There were actually 9 vessels, including the Elliot and the other transport, the Barnett, which was carrying the 1st Battalion and Headquarters and Service, H&S Company of the 1st Marines. Only one warship was escorting them, the light cruiser Boise, which carried 2 seaplanes to observe for submarines. On the 3rd day of the voyage, June 24th, Berghaus noted that the convoy was heading in a southwesterly direction and was now off the coast of Mexico. The mystery of their destination was resolved when Vandergrift in New Zealand sent a message informing them that they were bound for Wellington, New Zealand, and admonishing us about our behaviour. To improve morale, the band of the Ericsson played music every morning and afternoon on the fantail, which had a positive effect. On the evening of June 25th, the troops were treated to a concert on the bow, closing with the Marine Corps hymn, to which all rose and most sang along. To Berghaus, "The men seem more like kids when listening to the music, not as tough as they pretend." At his headquarters in the Hotel Cecil in Wellington, Major General Vandergrift was also relaxed on this day, largely engaged in official calls and other matters of protocol. The training of the 5th Marines and other units of the 1st Echelon of his 1st Marine Division, which had arrived 11 days earlier on Sunday, June 14th, was proceeding according to plan. Even the radioed dispatch he had just received from his U.S. Navy superior, Vice ADM. Robert L. Gormley, Comsopac, asking Vandergrift to come up immediately to his Auckland headquarters, did not faze him. Vandergrift figured it was just for the official call on Gormley, who had himself just taken up his position in Auckland as commander, South Pacific, on June 19th. Gormley had delayed the request days past Vandergrift's arrival. After flying up to Auckland the following day with his staff, Vandergrift was hustled directly to Gormley's headquarters. This was not going to be just a protocol visit. In a brusque manner not characteristic of the intelligent, quiet, most gracious individual he knew, Gormley immediately brought up the matter on his mind. "Vandergrift, I have some very disconcerting news," Gormley announced. "I'm sorry to hear that, Admiral," Vandergrift replied. Handing Vandergrift a top-secret dispatch, Gormley responded, "You will be more sorry when you read this." It was a secret dispatch dated June 24th, Washington time, from ADM, Ernest King, U.S. Navy Commander-in-Chief, to ADM, Chester Nimitz, CNC PAC, that had been copied to Gormley for his information. The JCS had directed that an offensive be launched against Japanese forces in the Lower Solomons. The Santa Cruz Islands to the east were to be seized and occupied, as were Tulagi and adjacent areas in the Solomons. The target date of the offensive was set for about August 1st. Reading the dispatch, Vandergrift was shocked into disbelief. This was in effect a warning order that directly affected his 1st Marine Division as the only amphibious landing force under Sopak's command. Vandegrift didn't even know what islands were in the Lower Solomons, or where Tulagi was, and his division was spread over Hell's half-acre, the 7th Regiment in Samoa, the 5th there in New Zealand, and the 1st still at sea. "I just don't see how we can land anywhere by August 1st, Vandegrift told Gormley. In agreement, Gormley replied, "I don't see how we can land at all, and I am going to take it up with MacArthur." He would ask for a temporary delay in the landing, but in the meantime Vandegrift would have to go ahead as best we can. Returning to Wellington the same day, Vandegrift began taking the initial steps in preparation for the operation thrust upon him. Since its success would depend on surprise, all preparations would have to be carried out in utmost secrecy. Those shouldering the heavy responsibility would mainly be Pearl Harbor. Enlistees rushed through abbreviated Paris Island recruit training and aborted New River training, and most recently idled by the long sea voyage to New Zealand. First, his 5th Regiment, which had settled into its camp at Paikakariki and was undergoing rigorous training following its arrival on June 14th, would re-embark on 3 assault transports, ostensibly for preparing for amphibious training to disguise its real purpose. The 5th Marines, along with the 2nd Battalion of the 11th Marines and other supporting units, were designated Combat Group A, and the yet-to-arrive 1st Marines, supported by the 3rd Battalion, 11th Marines and other units, were named Combat Group B. Working parties would unload 10 cargo vessels and combat load the supplies and heavy equipment on 23 transports and cargo ships, leaving behind tentage, trucks and other vehicles, and reducing fuel and food to a 60-day supply and ammunition to 10 days of fire. In very high wind, low clouds and rain, Bayard Berghaus watched from the deck as the John Ericsson approached Wellington Harbour and tied up at Pipitea Wharf at 13:20 on Saturday, July 11th. The 19-day voyage from San Francisco to New Zealand had finally come to a welcomed end. The band was the first off the Ericsson. It was to play the Marine Corps hymn on the dock as Major General Vandegrift and his operations officer, Major Jerry Thomas, boarded to greet the Assistant Division Commander, Brig General William H. Rupertus, who was in charge of the rear echelon. Many of the men on the Ericsson were throwing packs of cigarettes to New Zealand soldiers on the docks, who scrambled like kids after coins. On board the George F. Elliot, which had reached the wharf just after the Barnett with his 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, Lieutenant Colonel Pollock was distressed about the change of plan for the rear echelon that he had received just before arrival. There would be no period in New Zealand to complete training, which had been expected to include landing practices in Wellington. Instead, they were to unload all ships and reload for combat on arrival. His 900-man battalion, reinforced with H Battery, 11th Marines, and a platoon each from the 1st Engineers, 1st Pioneers, and 1st Amphibious Tractor Battalions, was being designated Combat Team 5 in Combat Group B. Pollock would command the team. PFC Sid Phillips was also disturbed by the plans for the battalion just after its arrival. Barely hours before the Elliot reached the Wellington docks, he'd heard an announcement that the battalion was going to engage in large and extensive manoeuvres with the 5th and 11th Regiments. The men were to remain aboard the ship. There would be no liberty for his H Company men or the others. But there was no word about any impending combat or the real reason they would be remaining on board, information to which only Vandegrift and his staff and senior commanders were privy. Unlike the 2nd Battalion on the Elliot and the 1st Battalion on the Barnett, the 3rd Battalion, as well as the other units on the Ericsson, would not be held on board their ship. The Ericsson was not a combat transport, unlike the others, and had been used only to transport rear echelon troops to their New Zealand destination. The following morning, after their last official meal on the Ericsson, Berghaus and the others of Lieutenant Colonel McKelvey's 3rd Battalion picked up their combat packs and marched about a mile to Aotea Quay, where the attack transport USS Macaulay awaited them for boarding. Berghaus and his fellow junior officers of L Company were pleasantly surprised on entering their assigned stateroom, number 18. It was a vast improvement over their room on the Ericsson. Gil Small and other officers and men of I Battery, 3rd Battalion, 11th Marines, were also headed towards Aotearoa to board the Macaulay, which they found out had been berthed there 3 weeks after its arrival from Tonga. Small would be sharing a stateroom with 5 other junior officers, all from his I Battery except for 1 infantry officer. He felt his new quarters were immaculately clean compared to those he had on the Ericsson. Small was also informed that his I Battery was being attached to the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines. Unknown to him, the battery was now part of the newly designated Combat Team 6, Combat Group B, under Lieutenant Colonel McKelvey. In addition to the artillery unit, the 3rd Battalion would also be supported with platoons of pioneers, amphibian tractors and engineers. During the following days, Sid Phillips and the other privates and privates first class spent their time unloading the transports and cargo vessels berthed at Aotearoa. It was hard physical labour carried out in constant and penetrating cold and rain. Boxes of supplies were simultaneously being offloaded from vessels to form high stacks on the quay and, after being moved to other locations, reloaded on the attack transports and cargo vessels according to combat loading rules. Despite the nearness of the war to New Zealand, the unionised civilian dock workers had refused to do the work because of the foul weather, leaving Vandergrift with no other option than to order his own men to do it. Phillips and the other lowest-ranking enlisted men were angry that the New Zealand dock workers had forced them into performing such physical labour. They also resented that in the Marine Corps all such heavy labour was to be performed by privates and privates first class alone. Berghaus, Small and the other junior officers and NCOs were assigned supervisory roles for the 20-man working parties in unloading the Ericsson and reloading on the Macaulay. For the low-ranking enlisted men, it was a brutal schedule. 4 hours on and 4 hours off, 24 hours a day. They really hate to get up at night, Berghaus noted in his diary. Phillips wondered why they were combat loading the Elliot if they were just going on manoeuvres. This seemed ominous, occasioning endless rumours of what was in the making. It appeared that even the junior officers didn't know what was behind the frenzied activity. Phillips's working party was under the command of Sergeant Vester Ulbriton of his own mortar platoon, a fellow Southerner from Mississippi. Unlike the junior officers, he stayed with his men the whole time as he supervised the 4-hour shifts. Since it was too cold and noisy to sleep aboard the Elliot, Phillips and his men slept under a thick canvas tarp on the floor in a corner of a warehouse on the quay. During their 4 hours off, when they weren't sleeping, Phillips and his contingent would walk a few blocks across the quay into downtown Wellington for a meal or a movie, to keep warm. They saw few young New Zealand men, almost all of whom were in military service overseas. At night the town was browned out, with only a few lights showing. To Gil Small, the enlisted men now shifted to the Macaulay surprisingly didn't seem to be that keen on the abundantly available females, who were more than ready to be companionable. He often heard from a man just back from his 4-hour shore leave, "If that's liberty, give me death." Small himself, always highly observant, was put off during his frequent visits to town when he noticed that many girls of 18 had complete sets of false teeth, which he attributed to the lack of calcium in the water and soil. Cosmetics were little used, but he found the people in general to be very friendly and enjoyed listening to them talk in their Cockney accent. Unloading the Ericsson was supposed to be completed by 1600 on July 16th, with departure on the Macaulay set for the following morning. Small was informed, but he doubted this schedule could be adhered to. Confusion still reigns with the infantry from Colin McKelvey and Major Walker Reeves on down, he observed, compared to the efficiency of his I Battery in the loading process, in his estimation. On the afternoon of July 15th, the battery's gear had begun coming on board. There was still no definite word yet on where they would be sent, but it didn't look like it would be for manoeuvres. Small had heard that an admiral from the States would be coming aboard, so we feel no doubt we are loading for bear. Unknown to Small and the other junior officers and enlisted men, Major General Vandergrift was meeting in Auckland with that same Admiral and Vice Admiral Gormley. Rear Admiral Richard Kelly Turner, Vandergrift's superior as commander of the amphibious force in the envisaged landings, had just arrived earlier that day. At the conference, the irascible Turner objected to aspects of the plan that Vandergrift's operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Gerald C. Thomas, had developed, but with no plans of his own, he could not stop Gormley from going ahead with it, now codenamed Watchtower. Thomas had learned earlier that Guadalcanal should be the focus of the operation, as had Turner at the same time. Intelligence had indicated that the Japanese were building up an airfield base on the Lower Solomons Island. But Vandergrift explained that because of the heavy rains, loading of the vessels for the operation was delayed, and thus he couldn't meet the original sailing date, set for the next day. Turner agreed. His naval forces would not be able to keep to the original schedule either. To facilitate meeting the August 1st target landing date, Vandergrift offered to forego the rehearsal practice planned in the Fijis from July 27th, but Turner decided to go ahead with the Fiji practice anyway and reset the departure date from New Zealand to July 23rd, a delay of 5 days. With the rehearsal now confirmed and taking into consideration the delayed departure date, Vandergrift secured Gormley's approval to set the landing date for 6 days later. Nimitz and King concurred, and a new date of August 7th was subsequently incorporated into Gormley's Operation Order 142. On the following day, Thursday, July 16th, regimental and battalion commanders of both echelons were brought into the picture for the first time. Vandergrift had called them together for a division conference at his headquarters in the Hotel Cecil in Wellington to brief them on the operations plan. Colonel Clifton Cates's 1st Marines, along with Colonel Leroy Hunt's 5th Marines, would be landing on the Japanese-occupied island of Guadalcanal, with Brig General William Rupertus taking 1 battalion from the 5th Marines, along with a battalion of the 2nd Marines, plus the 1st Raider and Parachute battalions to land on Tulagi, across from Guadalcanal, and its neighbouring islets. "Guadalcanal? Never heard of it before," Lieutenant Colonel Pollock reacted when informed of the objective for his 2nd Battalion. With members of his staff, he now went over the orders, a map, and photos given them before being handed the orders for his Combat Team 5. The key map was one of the northern coast of Guadalcanal, a primitive rendering drawn on July 14, 1942, based on a local's memory. Back on board the Elliot, Pollock met with his staff to begin making preparations for the landing on Guadalcanal. Earlier, on July 10th, while still at sea, Pollock had shaken up his staff and brought in a new battalion operations officer. He had replaced the incumbent, 2nd Lieutenant Billy Pierce, with E Company's executive officer, Bill Larson, who had earlier been moved up from his initial weapons platoon position. Pierce, a fellow PLC graduate with Larson, was reassigned to take over Larson's old weapons platoon job in E Company. Larson had been taken by surprise by Pollock's decision and was not happy about leaving his old company, but I had no choice in the matter. He figured that Pollock had been impressed with Larson's work in handling the billeting of his 2nd Battalion on the Elliot in San Francisco, a special task Pollock had assigned him. In his new capacity as Bean 3, Larson would now be working closely in planning for the Guadalcanal landing with the battalion intelligence officer George Stratton, yet another fellow PLC graduate. While Vandergrift and his commanders were absorbed this day with planning and preparation for the forthcoming landings on Guadalcanal and Tulagi, the junior officers and enlisted men were continuing the loading of the transports and cargo ships on Aotea Key in cold and rain. Gil Small of the 11th Marines' Wa Battery, along with the 2nd Battalion's Herman Abady of K Company and Larry Hennessy of M Company, spent the entire afternoon assisting Lieutenant Colonel McKelvey in supervising the movement of shells from the ammunition dump to the side of the Macaulay for loading. Small was unhappy with the poor organisation and execution of the job. They had to supervise men not of their own units and whom we didn't even know, resulting in poor control over them. In his view, NCOs, rather than 2nd lieutenants, should have been assigned the job and could have more properly provided the supervision. The next day it was the turn of Bayard Berghaus, and fellow L Company officer J. Griffith to supervise working parties in the loading of the Macaulay. McKelvey's executive officer, Major Walker Reeves, had assigned them watch periods for their supervision assignment. "Not much fun," Berghaus complained after putting in his first watch, 2200 to 0200. "Hardest part is rousing the men to go out," he felt. The next watch for Berghaus and Griffith was from 1200 to 1700 the following day, supervising the loading of the cargo vessel Libra, AK-53. But at least the sun had finally made an appearance, easing the task, although it was still plenty cold standing in the wind. Then, on the night of July 18/19, they had to get up for a 0200 to 0600 watch. Berghaus was so drowsy that he slept through breakfast and lunch after he returned to his stateroom. The next day he had to get up at 0530 to join Griffith in supervising the procurement and moving of grenades from the ammo dump to be loaded on the Libra, and they were not relieved until 1200. If the supervisory work was a pain for Berghaus and his fellow junior officers, it was proving downright exhausting for Sid Phillips and the lowly enlisted men tasked with providing the physical labour. Phillips and the 2nd Battalion men on the Elliott were spending days and nights on Aotea Key in freezing cold and drizzle, mostly stacking cases of grenades and clover leaves of artillery and mortar shells, and moving rolls of barbed wire to be loaded on the Elliott for their infantry battalion, and supporting Pioneer and Engineers platoons, and H Battery of the 11th Marines Artillery. But on Tuesday, July 21st, their ordeal was over. Combat loading of the Elliott was finally completed after 9 days of round-the-clock labour, the roughest duty Phillips and the others would ever endure in the Marine Corps. On the sister transport Macaulay, loading work was also finished that day, ending all dock working parties, much to the relief of Berghaus and his fellow junior officers. At 16:25, we cast off the hawsers and pushed out into the stream and dropped the hook for the night layover in Wellington Harbour. All liberty had been cancelled. 2 days earlier, Gill Small had noted many high-ranking officers coming aboard, and on the day before leaving they were joined by Major General Vandergrift and his staff. Indeed, as confirmation to Small, it appeared that the Macaulay was going to be the flagship of the Expeditionary Task Force. In the harbour with the Macaulay, he noted the presence of other transports, supply ships, cruisers and destroyers. That night, Sid Phillips and his buddy PFC, John Deacon Tatum, were up on the deck of the Elliott as she lay in Wellington Harbour, talking about the future and what it might hold in store for us. The sea was quite rough, and a cool, strong wind was blowing. "Where are we going?" Phillips and Tatum wondered. No one knew but Lieutenant Colonel Pollock, he figured. On a beautiful fair day, the morning of Wednesday, July 22nd, 1942, Gill Small observed the impressive panorama of the low, steep hills surrounding Wellington Bay as the Macaulay moved out of the landlocked harbour at the head of the column of 8 transports and 4 cargo ships. Outside the harbour, 5 cruisers and 7 destroyers picked them up to form the convoy, now heading northeast. The last land view was of the large, snow-clad peaks on the South Island. Just before noon, cruising positions were taken up, with 3 cruisers in the lead, 3 columns of transports and freighters, 4 abreast, and the 2 other cruisers in the rear, with the destroyers around the edges. It was a formidable force, but for First Sergeant Abe Felber of H&S Battery, 11th Marines, on board the Hunter Liggett, I would feel safer if there was an aircraft carrier or 2 to join us. As he departed Wellington on board the George Eliot, Lieutenant Colonel Pollock was more preoccupied with the state of his supplies and equipment than the view or the security of the convoy. He had had an awful time getting enough together to outfit his 2nd Battalion for its upcoming landing on Guadalcanal. It was very upsetting for him that most of his equipment was left behind in Wellington. It was not only Pollock's battalion that was leaving for a combat operation inadequately equipped and supplied. Because of extreme shortage of shipping, Vandergrift was forced to order that only that which is necessary to fight and live should be taken. As a result, bulk consumables, fuels, lubricants and food were cut to 60 days of supply and ammunition allowance to 10 days of fire for all weapons, while less than half of the motor transport that had been authorized for the division was loaded. Part of the 1st Tank Battalion and the entire 4th Battalion of the 11th Marines, with its 155mm howitzers, had to be left behind too. When Bayard Berghaus and his fellow 3rd Battalion comrades on board the Macaulay awoke on the morning of Thursday, July 23rd, they found themselves in a man-sized storm with rain, high wind and huge waves. Chairs had to be roped together to keep us from sliding all the way across the wardroom and back. Gil Small was the exception in not becoming seasick. Conditions were pretty rugged for his I Battery men, quartered in the foremost compartment, what with all the pitching, rolling and water washing over the well deck above them. But at least the suspense was now over about their combat destination. It was Guadalcanal. The junior officers and men were given the dope on their first operation. Berghaus felt that arrangements seemed okay. "We'll have a lot of support," he felt. The next day sea conditions were no better. Wind, rain and huge waves. "The ship is rolling like the devil, and the waves are coming over the bow and sides." Berghaus had a difficult time inspecting the sentries on his guard duty. Many were seasick and having a tough time to keep on their feet. On board the Hunter Liggett, 1st Sergeant Felber was forced to take to his bunk. The ship was plunging and wallowing in great long swells. The decks were awash, the seas striking against the Liggett with a noise like battery rams. That evening, on the Barnet, 2nd Lieutenant Irving Perrine was too worked up to worry about keeping his balance in the rough weather. The 1st Battalion's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Cresswell, had called him into his office with some startling news. He told Perrine that, for some time, he'd wanted Perrine on his staff, and now the time had come. He was to be transferred from his executive officer position with C Company to become the battalion intelligence officer. "It's flattering and definitely a promotion," Perrine wrote to his parents, though he would have to serve out the year to get his silver 1st lieutenant bar. While he felt inadequate at present for the promotion, "I am determined to learn fast and do a good job," he wrote in his letter. But it seemed his aspirations to participate in combat operations were now fading further away. When day broke on Sunday, July 26th, the troops on board the transports were relieved to find that the storm had finally run its course. The sea was now calmer, and their ships steadier. At 12:30, Felber spotted a group of war vessels on the horizon approaching their convoy. Straining to make them out, it looked to Berghaus as if there were 30 to 50 of them, including 2 carriers. Said to be the Enterprise and the Saratoga, and oodles of cruisers and destroyers. Gil Small made out 3 carriers, including the Wasp. As far as the eye could see from the Macaulay, there were ships all over the sea, even to the horizon, a very impressive sight, he noted in his diary. By midday Monday, July 27th, the mountainous islands of Fiji were sighted, and cruising speed diminished. They were now in the Koro Sea, with calm waters, blue and extremely clear and transparent, more than I have ever seen, Berghaus noted. Most of the warships in the convoy had left the transports and cargo vessels, reportedly to go ahead and meet them where the rehearsals would be staged. On the Hunter Liggett, Felber had read a dispatch circulated on the ship. The landing rehearsals this week involve landing through reefs on coral beaches on Koro Island. Most of the men were busy making up packs for the landing. On the Elliot, Deacon Tatum, just appointed acting corporal in his mortar squad, was getting everything ready to disembark at 1600 the following day, with his buddy Sid Phillips and the others in the Higgins boat to which they had been assigned. On the Macaulay there were drills in the morning and afternoon for assembly in preparation for debarkation. Gil Small spent most of the afternoon in the wardroom, preparing a grid sheet for the Koro landing, making use of what little drafting ability I have. At 0600 on Tuesday, July 28th, Gil Small was awakened for an early breakfast on the Macaulay, but spent most of the rest of the morning waiting around for the Koro landing exercise to commence. Finally, at 11:45, the order was given, and he went over the side with the others, clambered down the cargo nets, and jumped into the bobbing Higgins boat assigned to him as a forward observer for his I battery. After milling around at the line of departure until 1400, Small's wave finally began speeding in a line abreast towards the section of the northern shore of Coro, codenamed Red Beach, designated as the landing area for the 3 battalions of the 1st Marines. But shortly into the 3,500-yard dash to the beach, the engine of Small's boat began overheating, and the coxswain was forced to abort the attempt. The Higgins boat was towed back to the Macaulay, where Small and the other 36 occupants were transferred to a ramp boat and set out again for Coro. But the day's frustrations were not over for them. About halfway to the shore, they met the Macaulay's first wave, carrying Berghaus and the others in the rifle companies of the 3rd Battalion. It had been ordered back without landing because its boats had encountered large coral heads that could have damaged their propellers if they had continued on. So it was back to the Macaulay for Small's boat too. With a few exceptions, it was the same story for the Elliot and the Barnett, carrying the other battalions of the 1st Marines. They too were prevented from going ashore because of the coral menace. However, some boats of the 2nd Battalion's E and F companies in the first wave off the Elliot did manage to continue all the way into the shore, avoiding the coral heads. The coxswain of the Higgins boat carrying 2nd Lieutenant Ed Craig and his F Company platoon managed to get the boat right up on the beach, where the men jumped overboard onto terra firma. But when 2nd Lieutenant Dean Stover in E Company saw the men in the Higgins boat just ahead of him jumping overboard into water over their heads and struggling to get back on board, he refused to let his platoon's men repeat that performance and held them in the boat until he was informed that the landing operation had been cancelled and the boats ordered to return to the ship. However, the ramp boats carrying forward observer Nat Mewhinney and the H Battery artillerymen in the 3rd wave off the Elliot were able to get in closer than Stover's boat and disembarked in water only waist deep. Sid Phillips, Deacon Tatum, and their fellow mortarmen in H Company were in the 5th wave off the Elliot and were approaching the shore, having eluded the coral up to that point. But some 100 yards short of their landing location, they were ordered to abort and head back to their transport. Phillips and many of the others were sorely disappointed. They were looking forward to going ashore on a tropical island for the first time in their lives. It was the second upsetting development for Phillips and his platoon. During the loading of their boat, a 50-pound roll of communications wire fell from the deck into the boat, striking PFC Earl Jontiff with a grazing blow that broke his arm. Without the quick intervention of Deacon Tatum, who saw the falling wire just in time and pulled Jontiff to the side, their comrade most likely would have been killed. The following morning, at 0905, the Elliot sent out boats to pick up those officers and men of E and F companies and H Battery who had spent the night on Coro. When they came on board again, they regaled their envious 2nd Battalion comrades with descriptions of the coconuts, lemons and bananas and chicken they had eaten the previous day and evening. "Our mouths were watering for that delicious fruit we were missing," Deacon Tatum recorded in his diary that day. Separated from the others of his F Company, Ed Craig had stumbled into a big barbecue being put on that evening by several platoons of the 5th Marines as they roasted pigs and chickens left behind by the natives. The party was broken up when the CO of the 5th Marines discovered this violation of orders. Pursuit B.J. Wilson and the others in F Company's 1st Platoon, however, enjoyed no barbecue that evening. They had spent a sleepless night on the ground, kept awake by the noise of the engines of Higgins' boats and shouts of coxswains trying to free their landing craft from the coral heads on which they were stuck. For the officers and men on the Macaulay, July 29th proved a boring, hot and humid day. With no men to pick up on Coro, the flagship just lay off the island all day, with nothing but a boat drill and a school lecture to break the monotony. Gil Small spent most of the day in the sack, but did note that staff, divisional and intelligence officers from other ships were coming on board and were engaged in deep discussions. To International News Service, INS correspondent Richard Tregaskis, on board the Macaulay, the flagship was practically insane with activity, clogged with Marine officers anxious to get their orders and settle their plans. They needed to review their regiment and battalion level plans, as based on the division's Operation Order 7, 42 issued in New Zealand on July 20th before their departure for Coro, as well as the discussions held that day on the Macaulay. On the third day of the exercise, Thursday, July 30th, the officers and men on board the Macaulay, Elliot and Barnett repeated the first day's landing operation, except that as per orders they proceeded in their boats only to a line 2,000 yards short of Red Beach, arriving between 12:30 and 1300. To go further was to run the risk of hitting coral heads. The half attempt was synchronized with naval bombardment and aerial attacks on the shore. While waiting for the order for his wave to return to the Macaulay, Gill Small scanned the shore with his field glasses and was able to distinguish the primitive huts of villagers along the coastline. So far, he was unimpressed with the organization for the operation. He felt that the long wait imposed on the men at the assembly areas prior to debarkation from the Macaulay was quite demoralizing. The next day, the Macaulay was experiencing engine trouble, which Berghaus and Small took as the reason the flagship was just lying off Coro all day. They did not know that no further landing exercises were scheduled for that final day of the operation, except for the landing of the 2nd Marines on another beach. For Berghaus, the only interesting item of the day was when the anti-aircraft cruiser San Juan passed near their stationary flagship. He was impressed with how very up-to-date she was. On the Elliot, Sid Phillips, Deacon Tatum and the other enlisted men of the 2nd Battalion got the word on the objective of their upcoming amphibious assault, an island called Guadalcanal. The Japanese were building an airfield on it and had to be stopped. But their battalion and the other 2 of the regiment would have to cross 3 rivers. The high grass, swamps, old plantation and coconut trees would provide good cover for Japs. The going would be easier for the 5th Marines, ordered to head due west and hug the shoreline on their mission to seize the airfield. The information that the 2nd Battalion men were provided derived from 2 documents: the 2nd Battalion Operation Order drawn up 3 days earlier by the battalion's operations officer, 2nd Lieutenant Bill Larson, and the intelligence note prepared on July 29th by the intelligence officer of the regiment, 2nd Lieutenant George P. Hunt. According to the battalion operations order, after landing on Beach Red, about 5 miles east of Lunga Point, at 0+50 on D-Day, E and F companies would head west-southwest on an azimuth of 240 degrees, followed by G and H companies, with the objective of seizing a grassy knoll about 4 miles south of Lunga Point. They would first ford the ILU River, cross the corner of the Tanaru plantation, then traverse a grassy plain before crossing the headwaters of the Tanaru River into dense woods, and finally cross the Lunga River. This direction of attack was marked on a map that Hunt had prepared that day as traced from an aerial photo. At about 1700 that afternoon of July 31st, the Elliot and other ships in the task force stood out to sea, their next destination the Solomons. On the Macaulay, as he went below for dinner, Major General Vandergrift was reflecting on the poor execution of the rehearsal for the Guadalcanal landing, which he regarded as a bust. "I shuddered to think what would happen if those beaches turned out to have been defended in strength," he recalled in his autobiography. Not privy to the worries of their commanding general about the chances of his men against a strongly defended beachhead, Tatum, Phillips and W.O. Brown were spending the night sharing their own anxieties about the upcoming operation on Guadalcanal as the Fijis faded further and further away. "This dope on the island has brought a queer feeling over us all. We can either meet our doom or else victory," Tatum confided to his diary that night. When Bayard Berghaus came up on the deck of the Macaulay on the morning of Saturday, August 1st, he could no longer see Coro to the east, and even the larger islands of Fiji they had passed late the night before were only dim shadows on the horizon. He found it hard to believe that in a few days he would be in battle. While he had felt depressed about the thought when the Macaulay pulled out of Wellington 10 days earlier, now he actually looked forward to entering into combat with the Japanese on Guadalcanal. The following days on board the transports heading slowly for Guadalcanal proved monotonous. For Deacon Tatum on the Elliot, it was even a drudgery. Tatum and his buddy Sid Phillips were spending much of their time on deck singing and talking. On Monday, their H Company commander, Captain Ferguson, briefed them and their machine gun platoon counterparts on what they could expect when they entered battle with the Japanese. He bolstered the mortar platoon's morale by emphasizing the essential role the platoon would play with its 81 mm mortars. Shells for their mortars were issued on the morning of August 5th, along with .30 caliber ammunition for the machine gun crews of the company. Jack Rivers and the others in the 3 machine gun platoons loaded belts with a hand-cranked loader until their belts and boxes were full, alternating ball, tracer, and armor-piercing ammunition. The ammunition carriers of the mortar platoon were issued huge green canvas poncho-like contraptions with 3 pockets each to be worn over their full packs and loaded with 6 rounds of mortar shells, a staggering load for the men. On board the Macaulay, Berghaus was busy all the following day supervising the issue of .30 caliber ammunition to his L Company riflemen. But he was concerned that the men had lost their hardness since leaving New River 7 weeks earlier. "Our cramped quarters and hurry had left us no space or time for exercise," he lamented. Later that Thursday, August 6th, just before nightfall, Major General Vandergrift was up on the deck of the Macaulay, standing by the rail and worrying about the chances for his men in the momentous operation that lay ahead for them the next morning. Many of his Marines were but boys a few months out of boot camp. Their planned New Zealand training had been aborted, and they had only 10 days' supply of ammunition. He could have listed 100 reasons why the operation would fail. But he had prowled the decks of the flagship the days since leaving Coro, observing the young officers and veteran sergeants under his command, as they prepared the men for the vicious combat they could expect. They were all Marines, he reasoned, and they were fighting men, his secret weapon. He knew that, if the job can be done, we somehow were going to do it. As Vandergrift's men made final preparations early the evening of August 6th for disembarking from their transports for battle the next day, Colonel Ichiki and his 2,500-man detachment on Guam were preparing to board their transports, but not for a combat zone destination. The Ichiki Shitai had been ordered back to Japan. At 17:20, Second Lieutenant Genjiru Inui and the others went aboard the Daifuku Maru and Boston Maru in Apra Harbor. Inui was happy to be returning to his homeland and to see his parents and fiancée again, but he would miss Guam and the pleasant lifestyle he'd experienced on the tropical island the past 2 months.